There are certain men in this world who can look directly at the truth and find a way not to see it. I've known a few such men in my time, and I'll wager, dear friends, that you have too. But the story I want to share with you tonight is about one particular man who performed that trick with quite extraordinary dedication. His name was Lord Rupert Aldgate, Viscount Kestwick, and the truth he refused to see arrived, as so many truths do, in the form of a letter. He received it on a Tuesday morning in January of 1823, just as his secretary was arranging the correspondence by apparent importance. The envelope was plain, no crest. The handwriting was small and unhurried, confident in a way that suggested the writer had no interest in making an impression. The return address said simply, Miss Maren Quill, Sternfield Village, Northumberland. Lord Kestwick didn't recognize the name. He read the first paragraph while still standing, which was, I'm told, as much attention as he could spare before his coffee went cold. Miss Quill had written to express concern about the new star charts being commissioned for His Majesty's Royal Navy under Lord Kestwick's patronage. She had identified what she believed to be a systematic error in the baseline declination measurements. An error introduced, she wrote, by the observatory's reliance on a French reference table that had not accounted for an 8-year shift in polar drift. If the Navy's navigators set course by these charts in the North Atlantic, she said, they would find themselves east of where they expected to be, in fog near coast, with predictable consequences. She had included 3 pages of her own calculations. Lord Kestwick placed the letter on the edge of his desk. Anything requiring attention? Asked Mr. Tobias Pren, his secretary, who had the patient expression of a man accustomed to watching important papers be treated with creative disregard. A village woman believes she has found an error in the Royal Observatory's star charts. Mr. Pren paused. The charts we've already delivered to the Admiralty. The same. Shall I send her calculations to Dr. Britton? No. Lord Kestwick's answer came quickly, too quickly as he would later be forced to admit. Send a courteous reply, thank her for her diligence. Inform her that Dr. Oswald Britton is the most celebrated astronomer in England and that his methodology has been examined and approved. Mr. Pren looked at the 3 pages of calculations. There is considerable detail here, my lord. There is considerable detail in many arguments that remain wrong. Now, here, dear friends, is where I want you to lean in a little, because what happened next tells you nearly everything you need to know about Lord Kestwick in that moment. His cousin, who had been lounging by the window pretending to read the morning paper, looked up. You haven't read her numbers. I've read enough to understand the shape of the argument. You've read the name at the top, Maren Quill, Sternfield Village. Lord Kestwick said nothing. A woman, his cousin continued, going back to his paper, whose name you do not recognize, writing from a place you've never visited, about a subject you have trusted entirely to someone else. You are not dismissing her calculation, Rupert. You are dismissing the sort of person you imagine would produce it. Lord Kestwick rang for his secretary and dictated a polite refusal. The reply reached Sternfield 5 days later. Maren Quill read it in the upper room above her uncle's schoolhouse, where she had spent most of her adult life, turning a simple rooftop into something that worked like an observatory if you were patient enough and didn't mind cold. There was a brass refractor mounted to a wooden post, bolted through the floorboards. 3 logbooks filled one shelf, each numbered and dated. A correspondence folder, growing thicker every year, sat beside a candle that always went out before she was finished working. The letter from Lord Kestwick's office was extremely polite. His lordship thanked her warmly. His lordship assured her that the finest scientific minds in England had reviewed the charts. His lordship hoped the Navy's success in the coming season would demonstrate the reliability of modern British astronomy. It was, Maren decided, a masterpiece of language that said precisely nothing, while using only the most gracious possible words to say it. Her uncle, Mr. Isaac Quill, looked up from the arithmetical primers he was correcting at the kitchen table below. He could always tell when she'd received a letter that disappointed her, because she came downstairs with the same expression she'd worn at age 11, when she'd corrected the church sexton's measurement of the bell tower, and the sexton had laughed at her, and how it had subsequently cracked along the exact line she'd predicted. He answered. His secretary answered. Did he consider the calculations? No one who considered them would have sent this. Her uncle set down his pen. You are very certain. I measured the drift myself every clear night for 4 years. I compared it against records inherited from father's correspondence with 3 other observation societies. The French reference table is wrong, uncle. It was wrong when it was made, and it compounds further east you go. The Admiralty's charts will show a ship 18 miles off course by the time it reaches the waters off Cape Wrath. In winter fog, at night, that is not 18 miles. That is the difference between a lighthouse and a reef. Mr. Quill was quiet for a moment, then right again. Maren looked at the polite, useless letter on the table. Then she took out fresh paper. She wrote, Lord Kestwick. I understand that Dr. Britton is accomplished, and that his reputation precedes him. My concern is not with his reputation. It is with his reference table, specifically the Beaulieu meridian chart of 1814, which was derived from observations made at a magnetic latitude that differs significantly from the waters where your navy intends to operate. I ask only this. Request that Dr. Britton identify which baseline source he used for the polar declination measurement. If he used the 1814 Beaulieu table, ask him to show you by how much the needle's deviation has shifted in the 9 years since. I will show you the same shift using my own records. If we produce the same number, the question answers itself. If we produce different numbers, one of us is wrong, and verification costs less than a shipwreck. M. Quill. She sent it with her own money and included a second diagram. Lord Kestwick received the second letter during a meeting with the Admiralty commissioners. He recognized the handwriting. His cousin, who had come along for reasons that had nothing to do with navigation and everything to do with watching Lord Kestwick's face, noticed him set the envelope to one side. After the meeting ended, Lord Kestwick took the letter to the map room and read it in full. Both pages. Then he read it again. The question she had posed was specific and verifiable. It was not the question of someone guessing at an error from the outside. It was the question of someone who already knew the answer and was offering him the most efficient path toward discovering it himself. He summoned Dr. Britton the following morning. Dr. Oswald Britton was 61 years old, silver-whiskered, and possessed of the particular impatience that accumulates in men who have spent decades being right about things and have begun to regard the possibility of being wrong as a personal insult delivered by the universe. He read Miss Quill's letter with his chin elevated slightly. Who is she? A woman from Sternfield village. Her uncle runs the village school. Her training. Self-directed, from what I can determine. Dr. Britton set the letter down. Then, with respect, Lord Kestwick, I see no reason to engage with it. Every public project attracts nervous observation. She's not responding to something she read in print. She's describing observations she made herself over 4 years. She says she made observations. Which baseline source did you use for polar declination, Dr. Britton? The astronomer was still for a moment. The Beaulieu meridian chart is the accepted standard. From 1814. It is the standard. Is the magnetic North Pole in the same location it was in 1814? A pause that lasted just a fraction too long. The deviation is within acceptable tolerance. Lord Kestwick looked at the letter. She's asking you to show what that tolerance is, and to demonstrate it. I will not have my methodology reviewed on the basis of a village woman's hobby. I didn't ask you to accept her review. I asked you a question about your reference source. And I have answered it. He had not answered it. They both knew he had not answered it. Lord Kestwick looked toward his secretary after the astronomer left. Send a message to Sternfield. Tell Miss Quill I would like to know how she obtained 4 years of consistent polar observations from a village in Northumberland. The response he received described in plain terms exactly how she had done it. Her father had been a schoolmaster with an interest in natural philosophy. He'd maintained a correspondence with 3 societies, one in Edinburgh, one in Leeds, one run by a retired naval captain in Norfolk, who shared observation logs by post. When her father died, Maren had inherited the correspondence, the instrument he'd built by hand over 15 years, and the habit of recording every clear night with meticulous consistency. She had also, she wrote, been publishing her observations under the name M. Quill in the Transactions of the Northern Scientific Correspondence Society for the past 6 years. She included a list of titles. Lord Kestwick read the list once. Then he walked to his library, where he kept bound copies of that very publication. He found the name M. Quill in 6 issues spanning 5 years. He'd read all of them. He had argued publicly with 2 of them, a response to M. Quill's paper on stellar parallax that had appeared in the Edinburgh Review under his own name, and a sharper exchange the following year regarding the application of atmospheric refraction correction to high-latitude observations. He had been in correspondence, essentially, with a village schoolmaster's daughter from Northumberland. He had considered the author to be a reclusive naval pensioner, or a university professor who disliked society. Someone seasoned, someone who had spent decades building the kind of observational rigidity that produced that quality of precision. He opened the most recent issue. He found a paper by M. Quill, presenting a corrected table for polar declination drift, derived from 4 years of personal observation, cross-referenced with 2 independent datasets. It presented, in careful and annotated terms, exactly the error she had written to him about. It had been published 3 months before the Admiralty charts were finalized. Lord Kestwick sat with that information for a long time. Then he ordered his carriage. Dear friends, I want you to understand what it took for a man like Lord Rupert Aldgate, Viscount Kestwick, to travel 200 miles north in January. He was not a man accustomed to journeys of acknowledgement. He was accustomed to people coming to him, to chairs being pulled out and fires being built up. He was accustomed, if I'm being honest with you, to a world that had arranged itself around his convenience for 38 years. He told himself he was going to verify the instrument, to confirm the methodology in person. What he was actually doing, though he could not quite have said so, was going to see the person he had been arguing with. He arrived unannounced. The schoolhouse was a stone building at the edge of the village green, 2 stories, sensibly built, with a chimney that put out a determined column of smoke against the January grey. A wooden sign on the door said Quill's School, Arithmetic, Letters, and Natural Philosophy. A boy of about 12 was sweeping the front step. I'm looking for Miss Quill. The boy pointed upward without pausing his sweeping. She's on the roof. Lord Kestwick looked up. There was, in fact, a figure on the roof. She was crouched beside a brass instrument mounted to a post, making adjustments with a wrench while holding a logbook under one arm. She wore a dark wool cloak that had probably been serviceable once and was now simply honest. Her hair was pinned up in a way that suggested she'd done it herself in poor light and hadn't thought about it since. Miss Quill. She looked down. Her expression moved through recognition and then immediately into something that was not quite alarm, but was adjacent to it. Lord Kestwick. Yes. You didn't send word. I was told it might affect the quality of what I observed. She looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she climbed down the ladder at the roof's edge. Quickly, efficiently, as someone who had done it several hundred times, and landed in front of him on the flagstones with a small, definitive thud. She was younger than he'd expected. 27, he would later learn, though she carried herself with the self-containment of someone twice that age. "You came to argue about the Beaulieu table," she said. "I came to see your instrument and your records. Those are the same thing." He almost smiled. She brought him upstairs. The room was not large. It held a bed, a writing desk, 3 shelves of books, proper books, he noted, Flamsteed's Historia Coelestis, Maskelyne's tables, a copy of Laplace in French with annotations in the margins, and the logbooks, 6 of them, numbered and dated, arranged in order of completion. Against the window, a model of the northern sky built from wire and weighted pendulums, demonstrating the path of polar drift across a brass plate ruled with longitude and latitude lines. "You built this." "The wire frame, yes, my father built the plate." "When?" "I modified the design when I was 19. The original was his from when I was 12. Lord Kestwick picked up the nearest logbook. Every entry was dated. Weather notation, temperature, time of observation, instrument setting, result. Cross-reference to prior entry. The entries went back 8 years. "You sent your paper to the transaction 3 months before the charts were submitted to the Admiralty." "Yes." Dr. Britton would have received the same issue. "Dr. Britton is on the Society's mailing list." He didn't read it. "He may have read it and dismissed it," she said. "That is a different matter." Lord Kestwick looked toward the model in the window. "If I had sent your first letter to him directly." "He still would have dismissed it," Maren said, with the calm of someone who had thought about this carefully and arrived at clarity. "You would have saved us both some time, but the conclusion would have been the same. Dr. Britton did not dismiss my letter because you chose not to forward it. He dismissed the paper I published under my own name. That is a conclusion he reached without your assistance." Mr. Quill appeared at the door with tea, observed the situation with the practiced neutrality of a schoolmaster who had seen many situations, and set the tray on the desk. "Shall I stay?" he asked his niece. "No need." He nodded pleasantly at Lord Kestwick and withdrew. What happened in the next 2 hours, dear friends, was the kind of conversation that most people never get to witness, not because it was private, but because it required a very specific combination of arrogance and eventual intelligence, which is rarer than it sounds. Lord Kestwick read every logbook, not skimmed, read, asked questions, was answered with the precise patience of someone who had rehearsed this argument in her own mind many times and knew exactly which detail answered which objection. He asked how she'd accounted for atmospheric refraction at altitude. She showed him a correction table she'd developed over 3 years. He pointed out a night in 1820 where the recorded observation seemed inconsistent with the surrounding entries. She found the corresponding weather note. Fog until midnight, observation taken at 12:47 a.m. in a gap. She'd flagged it in the margin herself. "I almost didn't include it. I'm still uncertain whether it should weight equally." That uncertainty, that one honest, self-interrogating note in the margin, was when Lord Kestwick understood the difference between what he'd assumed about her and what she actually was. "Mim Quill," he said, "not a question." She didn't answer. "The paper on stellar parallax in the 1820 transactions. You argued that the standard correction was being applied at the wrong stage of calculation. You wrote a rebuttal in the Edinburgh Review. I argued that your proposed adjustment created an overcorrection in lower latitudes. You were right about lower latitudes," she said. "You missed that my paper was specifically about high-latitude observation." You replied the following year. Under M. Quill. I wrote back. "You did." He looked at her. "I called the author a rigorous and frustrating mind that refuses to accept any received wisdom without independent verification." I read that. I meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. "And you knew," he said slowly, When you wrote to me about the charts, you already knew we had been corresponding. Your name is on the rebuttal, yes. You didn't mention it. You dismissed my first letter without reading the calculations. I judged that informing you we had already disagreed in print for 2 years would not significantly improve your attention. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said, I suppose it would not have. If you're wondering, dear friends, whether any ship was already in danger, yes. One vessel had already departed. The HMS Veybourne, a brig assigned to hydrographic survey work in the northern waters, had left Portsmouth 6 days prior carrying the new charts. They sent a fast rider to intercept her at the pilot station in Newcastle, where she was making a provisioning stop. Maren's corrected table was reproduced by hand overnight, verified by 2 men from the local navigation society, whom Lord Kestwick summoned by express letter, and delivered to the Veybourne's navigator the following morning. The brig's captain, a methodical man named Hubert Cray, read the correction table, compared it against his own dead-reckoning notes, and turned slightly pale. These numbers are right, he said quietly. My own reckoning was off by 12 miles. I thought it was the wind. It was the reference table, Lord Kestwick said. Who caught it? Lord Kestwick looked toward Maren, who was standing 3 feet away in a travelling coat that had not dried properly since the rain in Gateshead. Miss Quill, he said, she caught it. The captain extended his hand. Maren shook it without hesitation. That was the moment, I'll tell you, not the discovery, not the argument, not the 200 miles of cold road. That handshake, that ordinary, equal gesture between a sea captain and a schoolmaster's daughter, was when something permanently shifted in this story. Then Dr. Britton moved to preserve himself, and the story got harder. He submitted a paper to the Royal Astronomical Society 3 weeks after the charts were corrected. In it, he described a recalibration he had performed on the Admiralty's baseline measurements, identifying and correcting a drift error in the Beaulieu table. He credited the detection to internal review within his office. He presented Maren's correction table, her numbers, her notation, even a quirk in her rounding method that was entirely characteristic, as his own professional revision. Lord Kestwick read the paper on a Monday. By Tuesday he had not slept. On Wednesday, Maren arrived at his London office. She sat across from his desk with the paper in her lap and her hands perfectly still. He copied the rounding error, she said. Yes. If he had derived these numbers independently, he would have rounded differently. He uses standard notation in all his published work. This is my notation. She opened one of her logbooks and placed it beside the paper. Here is the source. The match was unmistakable. Maren. He hadn't meant to use her first name. She didn't comment on it. What do you want to do? She was quiet for a moment. I want to answer him publicly, with evidence. The society may not give you a platform. Then we find a platform they cannot close. Before I tell you what came next, dear friends, subscribe to Moonlight at Marlow, because this is exactly the kind of story I live to tell, and I would hate for you to miss the ending. What came next was a public letter, published in 4 newspapers simultaneously, signed in full, Miss Maren Quill, Sternfield Village, Northumberland. It was not an accusation. It was a timeline, a dry, careful dated sequence of events. The observation records begun in 1816, the paper published in November of 1822, the letter sent to Lord Kestwick in January of 1823, the correction delivered to the Veybourne in February, and Dr. Britton's society paper submitted in March. At the end, she appended a single question for the Royal Astronomical Society. At what date had Dr. Britton's internal review commenced, and could they produce any documentation predating November of 1822? The Society's president, Sir George Nance, had intended to manage the matter quietly. He found that he could not. Independent fellows of the Society examined both sets of calculations. The rounding notation matched. 2 other signatures in Maren's logbooks, Mr. Isaac Quill's and the Norfolk naval captain, who had been her father's longtime correspondent, attested to dates years before the controversy. Lord Kestwick appeared before the Society's inquiry in April. "She wrote to me in January," he said, "and I did not forward her letter to Dr. Britton. I will not pretend that decision was based on technical assessment. It was based on the name at the top of the envelope and the address beneath it, and I have had considerable time to reflect on what that means about the standards I claimed to maintain." There was a silence in the room that Lord Kestwick did not rush to fill. Dr. Britton's paper contains Miss Quill's notation, Miss Quill's correction factor, and Miss Quill's conclusions, submitted under his name 3 weeks after her methods were used to correct a navigational instrument aboard a vessel of His Majesty's Navy. I leave the Society to decide what it wishes to call that. I know what I call it. Dr. Britton resigned from his fellowship 6 weeks later. He did not apologize. His reputation diminished. He continued to be received in certain drawing rooms. That was not the justice Maren deserved, and everyone in this story knew it. But the record was corrected, and the record, dear friends, is what persists. The corrected baseline table was published in the summer transactions under the author's full name, Miss Maren Quill. The editor added a note identifying her as the originating observer and analyst of the Northern Declination correction. She read it sitting in the upper room in Sternfield, with a cup of tea gone cold beside her. Her uncle knocked on the doorframe. "Well, it's in print. Your name. My name." He sat down across from her and said nothing, which was the most eloquent thing he could have done. Lord Kestwick came back to Sternfield in September, when the weather was mild and he had no particularly urgent excuse for the journey. He told himself he was inspecting the proposed site for a new weather station the county surveyor had asked him to fund. Maren, when she saw him at her door, looked at him with the expression of a woman who understood perfectly well that there was no weather station requiring his personal supervision. "The station," he said, "is 17 miles from here. I had additional business." He had brought her 3 years of the Edinburgh Philosophical Journal, including the issues containing the full run of their published correspondence. Her as M. Quill, he as Kestwick, neither of them knowing who the other truly was until now. He'd had them bound in good leather. Inside the front cover he had written, "For the mind I respected before I knew whose it was, and should have respected from the moment it first wrote to me." She read it standing at the door. He watched her read it. "You are learning," she said. "Slowly. That is usually how genuine learning happens." He stayed for dinner. He stayed for the following morning's observations. He stayed, in various capacities, for the rest of his life. They argued about everything, dear friends. About the proposed expansion of the Naval Observatory and who should direct it. She had opinions, and they were inconveniently specific. About the funding of scientific societies and whether anonymous submission should be standard practice, not exception, and the unmistakable air of a woman. About the 4 separate times he published a response to something she said without first checking whether she had already addressed the objection in a subsequent paper. She was appointed as the first female fellow of the Northern Scientific Correspondence Society in the spring of 1825. The vote was not unanimous. 14 of 23 members supported it. 14 is a majority, Lord Kestwick said. It means 9 men looked at the same record and decided the evidence was insufficient, she said. I'd like to know what evidence they would have required. More time. They don't have more time than I've already given them. I know. He handed her the certification. That is precisely why we start with 14. The letter she had written, the first one, the plain envelope from January, with 3 pages of calculations he had set aside before his coffee went cold, he kept in the right-hand drawer of his desk for the rest of his career. He showed it to men who came to him for patronage, young men, mostly with ambitious projects and the smooth certainty of people, who had never yet been wrong in any direction that cost them anything. He'd set the letter on the table, in front of them. "Tell me what you see." They'd look at the neat handwriting, the Northumberland address, the woman's name at the top. "A letter," they'd say. "Read the calculations." They would. Eventually, their expressions would change. "Now tell me," he'd say, "what you almost missed." That was his lesson, dear friends, and it was hard-earned. The truth does not become less true because the hand that wrote it is a hand the world has decided not to read. And intelligence, real intelligence, the kind that climbs onto a cold rooftop every clear night for 4 years, because the answer matters more than the acknowledgement, does not announce itself with credentials or a proper introduction. Sometimes it arrives in a plain envelope on a Tuesday morning. Sometimes we set it aside before breakfast. The only question worth asking then is whether we are humble enough and wise enough to pick it back up. If you'd like more stories like this one, stories of women whose minds outlasted the people who underestimated them, and men who were, in the end, genuinely better for the education, then come and stay with me at Moonlight, at Marlow. There are more letters where this one came from, and I intend to read every single one.